Hi, I'm Dylan Tritle. I developed my lesson plan for a theoretical new FNR course called The Conservation of Vulnerable Tree Species. This course would go over tree species that are in danger because of range loss or severe population reduction, and it would focus on trees in the eastern United States. This course would include lectures on the ecosystem services and conservation issues related to these species, and would cover species such as eastern hemlock, American elm, American chestnut, maple leaf oak, longleaf pine, butternut, and more. And this lesson plan is for the butternut lecture. For this lesson, I decided on 4 learning objectives. The first would be to identify 2 possible transmission methods for the OCJ pathogen. OCJ is the fungal pathogen that causes butternut canker disease, which causes these cracks or cankers on the trunk of the tree. These cankers enlarge to the point where they girdle the tree and kill them. Now, OCJ can be transported through water by flowing down the trunk, and it's also theorized that it could travel through insects. My second learning objective would be to describe 2 major phenotypical differences between Juglans cinerea and Juglans allantifolia. Juglans cinerea is our butternut, and Juglans allantifolia is Japanese walnut. Japanese walnut is introduced walnut species from Japan that is hybridized with the native species naturally. It's important to be able to differentiate between these 2 species and their hybrids for conservation and management. My third learning objective would be to explain why the hybridization of these 2 species is opposed and how the rule of tens relates to how plants become invasive. Since Japanese walnut has resistance to the canker disease, hybrid and back-crossed hybrid trees are often developed for resistance, and many people oppose using them for conservation because they're worried that they will become invasive species. Now, the rule of 10 states that 1 out of every 10 species is capable of growing in any given environment, and that out of those 1 out of every 10 will be able to become naturalized in that environment. And out of those trees, only 1 out of every 10 will be vigorous enough to become invasive. So, in other words, it is very unlikely for these hybrid species to become invasive. My fourth learning objective would be to name 2 prominent diseases that affect white walnut species, and to explain the trade-offs in resistance that J. ex Bixby, which is the hybrid between Japanese walnut and butternut, faces because of them. So the 2 diseases that I'm talking about is butternut canker disease and walnut witch's broom. The trade-off is that while Japanese walnut is susceptible to witch's broom, butternut is susceptible to the butternut canker disease. So, unless they're hybridized, the trees will always be susceptible to one disease or the other. I chose 3 supplemental readings for this lesson, and I think they do a good job of summarizing and explaining a lot of the context behind butternut restoration. The first, from Silvics in North America, Volume 2, gives good context to the preferred habitat, reproduction, and growth habits of the butternut species. Second, I chose a Purdue Extension article called The Identification of Butternuts and Butternut Hybrids, and this gives good context on how butternut canker disease developed and was introduced, as well as some of the hybridization between Japanese walnut and butternut and how to identify those hybrids. The third supplemental reading I chose was from the Plant Disease Journal, and this article was called Walnut Witch's Broom Disease Threatens Restoration Efforts in Indiana. This article gives good context about walnut witch's broom and explores the effect of that disease on butternut restoration efforts. When the students come to the classroom, having already read their supplemental readings, they will be seated in 4 groups of equal size. This is for the group discussion. Once they've been seated, I start the class with a full lecture explaining the importance of butternut in the ecosystem, the history of butternut canker disease, and methods and issues related to its conservation. This lecture would last about 30 minutes and will give the remaining context necessary for a group discussion. Once the lecture is concluded, I will bring up a slide showing the 4 learning objectives for the day. Each group will discuss all 4 of the learning objectives and prepare an answer for each, and I would give them about 5 minutes to do this. This ensures that there is direct student discussion of the learning objectives so that everyone interacts directly with the information that I expect them to retain at the end of this lecture. Next, once they're done, I would randomly pick each group to give an answer to one of the objectives and encourage the class to improve on what answers they give if they're not perfect, using Socratic questioning to make sure that they come to the correct answer on their own. Randomly selecting a group ensures that all of the groups will be prepared to answer all of the learning objectives so that they don't only focus on one and not give any attention to the others. Finally, I want to make sure at the end of the lecture to give 5 minutes for student questions. I want to ask them what was confusing about the lesson and what difficulties they had understanding some of the topics. I want to make sure I do this so that the students are understanding the whole lesson and that they aren't lost at any point. Finally, after class, I would assign them a writing assignment. This assignment would be to find a new article that we haven't read as a class from a reliable source, either a scientific journal, an extension article, a document from the USDA, or something similar that relates to butternut conservation. This would encourage students to discover and read scientific articles on their own, which is a valuable skill for a natural resource professional to have. Once they found their source and they've read it, I will have them write a summary of it to be shared with the class in a discussion post, along with a link to the article so that others can read it if they're interested. And this summary would only be about 250 words, something relatively small, not worth a lot of points, but enough to encourage them to complete their assignment. This gets the students to share interesting articles amongst each other. That's all that I have for this lesson plan. I think it's important for people to think about those species that are rare, maybe not valuable, but add to the diversity of the ecosystems. And I think this lecture would be a valuable addition to many students' curriculums.